TV is weird.
Okay, so I want to do an episode of the show about the Netflix brand reboot of She-Ra for a while now, but I held off of it because, for a change, I didn't just want to jump in and talk about the same shit everyone else was, because I didn't. And also, when it first dropped the first season, I was sort of busy and it took a while to catch up. But the main things that were a big deal, I had kind of lukewarm takes on also, I guess. Like, I think the redesigned characters are good. Look, I'm a child of the era the original comes from. I grew up with the Filmation cartoons and Masters of the Universe, and thus by extension She-Ra, so I have a soft spot for the painterly pulp sci-fi backdrops and heavily recycled stock model figures, but come on, it's good that the characters aren't just the same one male and one female body with different hair and clothes now, and there's a variety of body types and skin tones and faces. That's positive, I dig it. That said, I'm not the biggest fan of the animation itself, which sort of feels like a less detailed, less expensive version of Avatar, kind of. I don't know, it's fine, but these are all pretty good designs. I feel like they deserve to move around more interestingly than they do most of the time, but that's hardly a deal breaker, especially because the writing is solid and that's the important thing.
Are you here to watch the social experiment too?
I also find myself not really caring all that much, at least not as much as I would have expected, about whether or not there will be any He-Man business in it eventually, considering, I probably would have never known what She-Ra was as a kid if it wasn't a He-Man spinoff to begin with.
Hello, He-Man. Sorry you missed all the fun. Who in the world is that?
T-Love, Man-at-Arms. This is my friend, She-Ra.
Nice to meet you.
Where's Princess Adora?
She's safe.
Right. Safe.
A female He-Man. This is the worst day of my life.
Obviously, it'll be fascinating to see if they do it. I know there's weird rights issues, but it's not the biggest deal to me. What they're doing stands on its own as a solid show for young kids. Cool. Anyway, speaking of He-Man, the original versions of both of these, one of the main reasons this new incarnation plays more interestingly is that it's allowed to have all of the characters, be actual characters. See, there's this misconception that the admittedly mostly extremely cheesy animated shows that dominated much of my era as a kid were often so stilted and flatly characterized was because many of them, like He-Man and She-Ra, were primarily made to market lines of toys, and the people making the shows either didn't care or weren't allowed to do anything interesting because it might get in the way of showing off the products.
Battle Cat and He-Man each sold separately, string not included.
That hook won't stop He-Man. Him traps over his vicious claw.
This is Princess Adora, sister of He-Man, and her gentle horse. Each sold separately, you can pretend.
She's lovely as a flower, but she has a secret power.
Now, that wasn't always the case. See, as I think most people are probably now aware, the reason the explosion in licensed cartoons happened in the 80s was because the Reagan administration deregulated aspects of the FCC that had previously mandated children's programming couldn't be just commercials dressed up like entertainment, but they didn't get rid of regulations entirely. So while bureaucrats and legislators were no longer policing kids' TV producers about selling products to children, they often ended up making up the difference by policing the types of content more than ever, not necessarily violence or action, but messaging and attitudes. Okay, your main character can be a doll and you want them to buy it, but it had better model positive behaviors. So whereas earlier kids' cartoon heroes like Yogi Bear or Bugs Bunny were allowed to be, funny jerks who mess with hapless idiots like Ranger Smith or Elmer Fudd just because, merchandising forward protagonists like He-Man and later She-Ra were often kind of boring.
Elena tried taking a magic potion which she thought would help her. Well, she found out there aren't any magic potions. And you know what? There aren't any magic drugs either. Anytime you take one from anybody but your parents or your doctor, you're taking a very big chance. You're gambling with your health, maybe even your life.
Don't expect somebody else to get you out of trouble.
Trouble you put yourself into. The way we did, eh, Glimmer?
I think that you've learned to trust your own abilities and limits, right, Bo?
You're right. But no matter how confident I feel, I'm sure glad She-Ra's around, just in case.
They were always good, they were always right, they always did the correct thing, they always learned or taught the right lesson. That's why all the memes and viral jokes and parodies that have endured about these shows tend to be about the bad guys, like Skeletor or the Evil Horde.
I've been waiting for so long now. I found someone to stand by me.
What?
Because those were generally where the writers had room to cut loose and have fun, because it was still okay for villains to be weird, compelling cartoon screw-ups, because they're the villains. You're not supposed to want to imitate them. Which always left very little tension, because both Skeletor's goofy crew of losers on Eternia and He-Man, and even the supposedly huge, well-organized army of the Horde on She-Ra, both felt like a bunch of dopey, uncoordinated children just flailing around until the competent grown-up heroes would show up and immediately just own their asses. So what the new She-Ra does instead is make all of the characters interesting, because basically everyone one is a dopey, uncoordinated child now.
We'll handle this the way we always do.
Brute strength?
Almost dying?
Plus, your friend over there can turn into a, 8-foot-tall lady with a sword, and I want her on my side.
Yeah!
They've taken the basic setup from the original series where the Horde is this technologically advanced alien force that's gradually spreading out and taking over a primitive, medieval, fantasy, fairy tale-esque planet, and just like the original, Adora starts out as basically a child soldier who's been raised in the Horde for as long as she can remember, but she finds a magic sword and realizes the Horde is bad now, and it turns out she's destined to become the Amazonian magical girl messiah of the good guys, and there's a whole team of other princes. You get the picture. But the new conceit is that the whole big war that kicked off this whole status quo now seems to have pretty much wiped out and or put way back on their heels most of the grown-ups on the good guy side, while the Horde is kind of all about robots and child soldiers for the most part. So most of the season and a half that's run of this so far has been showing us a war being fought mostly between the forces of light and dark, as represented by angsty, insecure, emotionally compromised teenagers on both sides, with the closest thing we see to an ostensible grown-up actively involved on the ground being Shadow Weaver, the second in command of the bad guys, and she's constantly all tore up by mom feels about Adora/She-Ra, because at first, the apparent big bad leader of the villains, Hordak, like in the original, isn't really a defined presence beyond, okay, here's the Dark Lord of the bad guy team, partly off screen, we've all seen the same set of stuff this is drawing influence from, so even if you don't know from the originals that the base concept for the Horde was classic monsters but for Masters of the Universe, and Hordak was kind of a big muscly cyborg Dracula, you think you know what you're gonna get. And then when he finally emerges in full, they throw a curve at you.
Nailed. You mean to tell me that you're still down a force captain?
Nothing will stop us from finding Adora and bringing her back.
No. You will elect another force captain and resume normal operations.
Yeah. Hordak, it turns out, is the smart one.
But my lord...
Enough. I have made my decision. Rise, Force Captain Catra.
Yeah, the second in command says, hey, so I'm going to take a bunch of resources and manpower to chase down this one AWOL soldier I'm personally fixated on for reasons, and he's like, no, you're not. That's dumb. We're running an army, not a surrogate, whatever your hang-up is, session. This is why we train more than one person for this stuff. Get back to doing what you're supposed to be doing. He recognizes talent, reinforces hierarchy, like it's common sense shit, but seeing as most villains in shows like this get undone by hubris and grandiosity and being obsessive, it's kind of weird to see one who seems to have at least read at least one book on building good management skills. Later on in the first season, there's a bit where Catra goes over Shadow Weaver's head to mess with the bad guy science stuff, and she flips out all, oh, just wait till Hordak finds out, and he's immediately like, what do you mean, wait till I find out? I'm the Dark Lord of this whole thing. I found out right away, and I had them run the idea by me. It sounded good, and I said, yeah, let's see what happens with that. Basically, yeah, the guy running the evil Horde is really good at running the evil Horde. And you realize in short order that that's not good news at all for the good guys, who so far have been eking out wins over another army that's roughly as inept and ill-prepared as they are, mainly on the strength of superhuman powers, and even then, only just so most of the time. Hell, they continually almost lose to Catra, and Catra does not have long-term strategies outside of show up, flirt violently with my crush, and maybe accomplish whatever else I came here to do today.
Hey, Adora. Hey, Adora. Hey, Adora. Hey, Adora. Hey, Adora. Bye, Adora.
Like, when they eventually come up against the guy who's basically just competent, they're going to get their asses kicked. And that's an interesting dynamic. Will they eventually go somewhere actually interesting with it? That remains to be seen. But for now, that's unexpectedly a different thing than I thought I was getting from this, so I'm here for it. For a change, the weekend decided to take a day off from making my life difficult, and we got this late-breaking announcement that the incomprehensible eldritch godhead that is the Netflix algorithm had
cast its cyclopean gaze on the numbers for Noelle Stevenson's She-Ra reboot, tabulated the infernal calculations in the ancient and terrible numeric glyphs known only to it, and bade forth...
Yeah, that seemed to work, so do another one. So now Kevin Smith is making a new He-Man show, which means I'm making a version of this face.
Stop it right now, or I take it all back.
I'm not saying anything.
And I say, hey, yeah, 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 hey, yeah, yeah.
Now, since I already did a whole ass episode about how I was very not correct about Kevin Smith having peaked years ago, I hope I don't have to rehash that at any great length and can jump right into clearing up that I was really big into He-Man when I was a much younger Bob, and I have a very soft spot for the exceptionally silly but delightfully so Masters of the Universe franchise in general. Here's me at San Diego Comic-Con this past year, here's that clip from the Godzilla 2 review with the action figure. So am I psyched for this? You betcha sweet ass I am, especially with the additional, though still light on the details, confirmation that the project, currently titled Masters of the Universe Revelations, will be a limited series that Netflix is calling an anime, with animation from the same studio that worked on Castlevania, which will continue the continuity, such as it was, where it left off from the original 1980s He-Man and the Masters of the Universe cartoon from Filmation, which, to me, feels like the right decision. Yes, I'm biased because it's the one I grew up with, and feel best, if not perfectly reflects the general Edgar Rice Burroughs meets Conan meets Flash Gordon by way of Mobius, Metal Hurlant, and Jack Kirby aesthetic of the first toys that the franchise can't help but keep reverting back to. I know the 2002 version had fans, I thought it was fine, but I don't know. I generally feel like He-Man is one of those wonderfully nonsensical, bizarrely thrown together, how the hell did this become so popular and why did it last properties where unless you're going to retool it from the ground up into something new and unironically good like they let Noelle Stevenson and her people do with She-Ra, it's best to just play the ball from the organically bad yet somehow awesome place that it naturally lands.
By the power of Grayskull!
And yeah, I am very much an admirer of the retooled She-Ra. I'm obviously not its target audience, which I think is a big mark in its favor, but I'm not exactly sure why it was as divisive among Masters of the Universe fans when it first showed up outside of general aesthetic preference stuff, which I basically get, i.e. why was it at all controversial to revive a cartoon aimed at the sensibilities of 8-year-old girls in the mid-80s as a cartoon aimed at the sensibilities of 8-year-old girls now? I mean, I mostly get the logic behind mature audience reboots of something like G.I. Joe Resolute, because it was always just a little bit askew that G.I. Joe was a cartoon about, like, actual military soldiers fighting a terrorist organization with tanks and rifles and knives and such, but sanded down for a kid's cartoon, so going, okay, here's what this would look like if we were allowed to draw bullets, makes a certain amount of sense, but She-Ra rides a rainbow Pegasus and has a mermaid friend and a peacock lady friend and a bow, so no, this was not meant to ever be turned into pastel Game of Thrones or whatever people think they wanted. Besides, remember when they redid Transformers as a big, angry, douchey army movie trying to be all gritty and grown up, and it sucked, and the fans especially hated it for like a decade, and then they changed course and rebooted those movies based on a kid's cartoon about toy robot cars into a movie about kids with a robot car friend, and it was great, and everyone was like, why weren't the Transformers movies always like this? This is good. How hard was that? And while I'm sure Smith's He-Man will likely skew a bit more mature, there's a heavier nostalgia component with this one, why else would you hire Smith, etc. For now, I kind of hope that the angle is a little bit more Batman the Animated Series than Adult Swim. Either way, it's going to come down to whether or not the writing is any good, and I don't just mean by comparison, because yes, I do agree that Stevenson's She-Ra is well written and probably the best written Masters of the Universe adjacent thing ever produced for film or television, but it's not like the bar is that high. Actually good He-Man writing outside of new She-Ra is pretty much just a couple episodes of original She-Ra, thank you Straczynski, literally one episode of the He-Man cartoon, and this one part of the live-action movie.
Of what consequence are you now? This planet, these people, they are nothing to me. The universe is power! You unstoppable power! And I am that force! I am that power! Kneel before your master! Fool! You are no longer my equal! I am more than man! More than life!
But okay, all anyone can do regarding this is speculate, and the only thing I'm an easier mark for than He-Man is the classic Mario stuff, and with He-Man it's kinda harder to take seriously somehow, so I might actually be more of an easy mark for that. Like, even if it does end up just being so much fan service, I'll probably still break down like old Matt Damon at the end of Saving Private Ryan the first time Battle Cat shows up. But here's a question that does interest me, though. See, the She-Ra reboot has so far elected to be coy about how much, if at all, they ever plan to show, bring up, or even mention He-Man. There's been conflicting information about how much they'd be allowed to use, which characters and words are owned by which company, that kind of thing. Although they've been able to at least use He-Man originating terms like Grayskull, Eternia, and Despondos from the 2002 series, and certain big revelations about Hordak and Adora's true origins from the most recent seasons seem to be pointing, if not in the same direction as the original continuity, then at least a very similar version, so who knows.
So Skeletor Catradora was originally a member of the Horde.
Hordak had just lifted Adora from her cradle and was about to take Adam too. We searched for you for many years, Adora, but we could not find the dimension to which Hordak had escaped. To spare Adam the pain of your loss, I cast a spell that wiped all memory of you and the Horde from the people.
In any case, what a lot of people were waiting for was, will Netflix do a He-Man reboot too, and if so, will it be connected in any way, like the old cartoons used to be? So when this was announced as both a Netflix project and a continuation from the original series, that would seem to suggest that the answer was a big hard no on all of that, since if this is jumping off from the 80s Masters of the Universe timeline, that had its own She-Ra already. That's what the new one was reimagining. But the thing is, maybe not? Okay, so this is kind of hard to follow, but short version, She-Ra, Princess of Power, was the spin-off of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, but it wasn't a concurrent spin-off, i.e. they weren't taking place in side-by-side continuity like Hercules and Xena. Granted, continuity doesn't really mean much in these series, because apart from the multi-part She-Ra pilot that was released to theaters, edited together and packaged as a He-Man and She-Ra movie, a few individual two-parters, both shows had mainly standalone episodes, so they could air in whatever order you wanted, without any long-running arcs. But in terms of the relatively few ways there are to timestamp with either one of these, She-Ra's show is generally shown to take place after the He-Man episodes, though neither of them get anything like an ending.
Sorry to disappoint you, but
Now, a lot of people feel like they remember these being concurrent because, again, they were made so you could watch them out of order and they'd play okay, but also because both shows only really ran new episodes for about 2 years each, respectively, and then went into a rerun rotation where they were often aired in blocks back-to-back in syndication. But during their original airings, there was only one brief few months in 1985 when both series were running new episodes at the same time, i.e. while She-Ra was just starting up and Masters of the Universe was burning off its last few episodes. But while She-Ra featured semi-regular cameo turns by characters and locations from He-Man, She-Ra herself and characters originating on her series never appeared or were mentioned on the He-Man cartoon, save for one glimpse of the Second Sword and the Sorceress origin story flashback, because they were at least planning that part of She-Ra by that point. So my question then becomes, when this Kevin Smith joint says picking up where the 80s version left off, what exactly do they mean? What? Obviously, it means it's not adjacent to the 2002 series, and one assumes it'll ignore the 90s and New Adventures of He-Man because everyone else did, so why rock the boat there? But does where the 80s left off mean where the entire 80s Masters of the Universe animated continuity left off, which would mean post-She-Ra? Or do they mean to specifically pick up from strictly where the original He-Man cartoon left off and head in a wholly different direction from where the continuity transitioned to focus on She-Ra under Filmation because that was the one still doing new episodes? And if so, are they doing it that way in order to, or to leave open the potential for whatever new continuum this establishes to cross over and sync up with the new She-Ra on the same platform, since they're both on Netflix? Really? No, I mean, I watched the show. No, there's no issue there. It's more, I mean, look, we talked about this when I did Clone Wars. There are still movies coming out. I mean, plus I just did a show about the series finale on Big Picture last week, and yeah, I know that wasn't a review, but it kind of got the point across, don't you? Well, okay then. You don't have to tell me twice. She-Ra and the Princesses of Power is a 21st century reboot of a 1980s animated series based on a line of dolls which spun off from a female-centric adjacent from the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe toy and cartoon franchise. The dolls attempting to combine a fantasy princess dress-up doll aesthetic with light elements of action figure weapon play, and the series noteworthy mainly for being nominally more lasting as a pop culture artifact by virtue of being, unlike the dolls, embraced by a cross-gender audience, mostly because it was effectively produced as a quasi quasi-continuation of He-Man, since the toy company had only made like one villain doll for She-Ra, and the line ended up using a hilariously mismatched scary monster set of bad guys originally meant for He-Man as antagonists, which made the whole thing like not necessarily good, but interesting visually, certainly. Which I feel like is a thing people probably know, right? And also that some folks feel nostalgic about the older version and were annoyed about this one, but none of that's really germane to a review, so we don't really need to get more into it than that. Acknowledged, okay? Moving on. Anyway, the new version, for legal purposes, pulls out the explicit He-Man connections, but otherwise keeps the same initial character setup, and for good measure, the original's offbeat, sparkly pastel princess pink good guys versus horrifying industrial goth space monster bad guys concede, at least at first, before gradually spinning off its own whole thing somewhere towards the middle. The medieval fantasy-esque planet of Etheria is being gradually conquered by an alien army of unknown origin called the Horde that's pillaging their resources, specifically ancient magic, ancient mystery technology, and child soldiers, because believe it or not, that actually was a plot point in the original. One specifically adept soldier called Adora gets separated while on patrol, finds this franchise's version of Excalibur, and learns she's actually a prophesized savior who can transform into She-Ra, a muscle-bound superhuman Valkyrie warrior type who apparently manifests to protect the planet from evil when in need. She also accepts, faster than you might expect, that her life is a lie and she's been fighting for the bad guys this whole time. It's a kids show. Which, yeah, was also basically the plot setup of the original series, but this time without finding all of this out from He-Man guest stars and the new running plot threads of She-Ra having to unite the, at first, not all friendly leaders of the other good kingdoms, who are also all teenage princesses and one younger kid because that's fun, to pool their resources and magic powers, and Adora having to deal with her former horde mate and best friend for life Catra feeling personally betrayed by all of this and opting to not only stick with the bad guys but rapidly rise through the bad military ranks so she can use their weaponry to basically go all Fatal Attraction on her former don't call it a crush. Yeah, so one of the multiple high marks of the series has often been given during its run was a lot of positive, matter-of-fact representation for LGBTQ characters, especially for a kiddie show, and while it's decidedly well distributed across the supporting cast, it's apparent pretty much right from the get-go that Adora and Catra are engaging in a literal Batman, Catwoman, hero-villain love-hate romance across the arc of the series is basically the centerpiece of this, and it really does work very well. It's not a coming-out tease or a self-discovery thing. The setting of this is very much a world where homophobia doesn't seem to exist. It's basic good guy, bad guy, former friend betrayal narrative. It happens to be two women, and they really nailed it, largely thanks to a good voice actresses and strong writing. I can't say that the entire series is itself perfect, even though by hinging its eventual main arc so much on that resolution of its two strongest characters, it ensures a solid finish. There are a few too many characters. Not every mystery or puzzle feels like it needed to be a mystery or a puzzle, and while I'm a big supporter of misdirection as a story device, occasionally some of the mythology involved here leans a little too much on the characters deceiving one another without discernible gain. That's not to say that most of these things don't end up being not really significant issues. TV shows aren't singular narratives. They're more like trees. Some branches are just going to end. I did find myself saying, you know, I could have done with more of that, less of that here and there. What makes it work overall for me in retrospect is that a lot of really small, smart, unique decisions informing an otherwise very solid, if standard, fantasy action narrative. I like turning the by now obligatory "the universe of the story just got a lot bigger" stakes-raising moment that a lot of such shows have literal instead of figurative. I like keeping the weird mix of sitcom humor, but also it's a giant war tone of the original, but more so. I like making She-Ra herself sort of the good-looking, popular, super skilled, but also kind of a dope, dumb jock of her own team. Like, she's not stupid, but she's definitely there because she's strong, huge, and has powers, but not brilliant or the brains of the outfit, and she's constantly charging in over her head or getting distracted by the thing between her and Catra that everyone but them notices. That's a fun angle. And I like a lot of the supporting cast. Scorpia especially is a fan favorite for very good reason. Just a wide, interesting cast. Again, probably too big of a secondary cast, but a lot of interesting characters peppered throughout. And while it does skew very young, unlike a lot of other series like this, it doesn't feel like it's trying too hard to signal to adults that any of the content is really for them, which I kind of honestly appreciate in this era where so many kids shows sometimes feel like they're being made mainly to have essays written about them looking at you, back half of Steven Universe. And I don't know if I would have bothered to check this out if it wasn't a remake of a thing I remembered from the 80s, but I thought it was a really solid version of itself. I mean, by default, it's probably the best actually unironically good narrative thing anyone's made from Masters of the Universe material. It certainly raises the bar for whatever Kevin Smith is going to do with his He-Man show. For now, I give She-Ra an 8 out of 10. All 5 seasons are streaming on Netflix. Definitely check it out if it's up your alley. So that happened. Yeah, if you or your kids, or both, were fans of the Netflix animated streaming series She-Ra and the Princesses of Power and were thinking maybe we can wait a couple days on watching the final season's drop of episodes without getting spoiled on, if not the ending, the big question of the series' central relationship, well, you probably should have either carefully muted or logged off your social media altogether over this weekend. Because after 5 seasons, the once controversial, if for very silly reasons, standalone 21st century reimagining of the one-time Masters of the Universe spin-off had built a much larger and certainly more devoted fan following than many had ever expected, which had been waiting on edge not just to see if the good guys would win, but if love would conquer all, and if one manifestation thereof in particular would actually play out to prove this, and make a bit of cartoon history in the process. So waiting was apparently not on the table for a plurality of devoted viewers who immediately dove in and binged the entire bloody thing, and if you thought you felt a ripple in the force on Friday, May 15th, as though thousands of perpetually disillusioned fandom hearts exploded all at once with the shock of not disappointment for a change, yeah, that's what all the commotion was about.
I kissed a girl.
Ah! Butthead! She said she just kissed a girl!
Damn it, Beavis. I know. That's what I was trying to tell you when you were talking about
No, it wasn't the only thing in the suitably frenetic and action-heavy climax that happened, but in terms of the reaction ratio between things fandom was hoping for and, wow, haven't seen that before, period, the gravity should be fairly self-evident. The title heroine, an established legacy character of not inconsequential pop culture stature, and her principal female nemesis to frenemy unambiguously declared romantic love for one another, mutually reciprocated, and saved the world with a kiss.
So many feelings, I don't know what these feelings want from me.
And going by the outpouring of, pardon the somewhat unavoidable pun, adoration from the series fans and the mutual binging aftermath, for fans of female-fronted genre fiction jonesing for A-list LGBTQ representation, the only thing that could have painted the day a few more shades of rainbow were if perhaps one of the other long-standing will-they, won't-they female-female pairings in a similar vein were to have paid off properly, which in fact then happened that same day.
We did it.
Granted, that second one is in much different context. Harley Quinn is a decidedly adult-targeted animated series, and in that case, the payoff was actually in keeping with a couple decades, give or take, of established prior characterization, and potentially a direct response to said characterization having recently been walked back in other depictions to a negative response. But the coincidence of its same-day occurrence does help underline the fact that it's easy to almost miss how revolutionary She-Ra's otherwise defiantly anti-dystopian climax actually was, even as, to dredge up a never-quite-stuck buzzword of the recent past, it doesn't get much more hope-punk than an apocalyptic battlefield being magically washed away by a sparkling Lisa Frank landscape for the victor and her girlfriend to giggle like schoolgirls in an awkward first embrace. After all, it's not exactly a secret that lesbian couplings are mainstream media's generally favored mode of public-facing progressive rep when it comes to LGBTQ inclusivity, both due to complicated social, economic, demographic, and algorithmic rationale, and also probably some more base rationales as well.
You know, when I see two girls kissing, it kind of gives me a special feeling.
Yeah. Me too.
And even aside from that, queer rep in Western animation generally has been having a moment for quite a few moments now, as of late. So there's certainly a temptation to look at this and say, yeah, okay, the 2020 incarnation of She-Ra likes women. So what? Are we still throwing a parade every time a TV studio or toy company throws out a diversity bone? No, of course not. That's a classic straw man. It is true that LGBTQ representation in pop culture has come a long way, but still has a long ways to go. Broad visibility doesn't necessarily always mean broad respect, understanding, or proper depiction, yes, but what's missed in the focus on the prominence of the characters in this case, that She-Ra is the main character of her own franchise, and that this ending effectively reveals the series itself's main storyline to have been a meticulously crafted, unexpectedly nuanced, if appropriate to the genre, very melodramatic love story between two women, is that this love story opted to offer fans, and in particular young LGBTQ fans, a rare fantasy of not simply romance and happy endings, but of both unencumbered by the weight of realities, prejudices, and barriers. Whereas many other series, particularly those with a presumed or defined youth audience that opted to approach such themes, often chose or were forced by fact of production, reality, to do so with the implied acknowledgement of real-world pressures and restrictions facing gay or bisexual relationships in the form of said pairings having tragic endings, occurring in the context of relationship triangles, wedded directly to one or both characters' coming out narratives, or even simply forced to exist as mere innuendo, like the Legend of Korra only being able to let its characters hold hands. She-Ra, while it did spend 52 episodes playing Mulder and Scully game with its two main fixtures, made it jointly apparent that the series wasn't interested in setting up another, however inadvertent, monument to same-sex love being inextricably bound to the narratives of repression and compromise. Even before the moment when the series, as confirmed by creator-showrunner Noelle Stevenson, explicitly threw down the "yeah, this is where we want to take it" gauntlet in the fan-favorite Princess Prom episode in the first season.
I don't know about you, but I am having a blast.
Whatever it is you're planning, it won't work. You sure?
Maybe my plan won't work, but then again, maybe it already has.
Cut, print, gay.
It had already established two sets of female supporting characters, one off-screen, one on, who were married and dating respectively, that main male character Bo behaved in a jointly attracted fashion to both male and female characters, and made reference to having two dads who turned up indeed as a married gay male couple in later seasons. Being a show for young kids, there's of course no indication that any of these romantic pairings extended anywhere beyond kissing, hand-holding, weddings, but suffice to say it was immediately and repeatedly established that in the world of this series, gender and sexuality were not rigidly adhered to priorities, by any means. In other words, there didn't seem to be a closet for either Adora or Catra to either be in or come out of on their planet. It never even comes up as a noteworthy question. So the entire what's going to happen between these two characters storyline is allowed to exclusively be about the emotional characterization, how they feel about each other, not how they feel about an entire gender. Now that might not sound like a big deal, but try and think about how many gay, bi, or trans love stories in media don't make prejudice or self-denial vis-a-vis is this something I want or am supposed to want a central part of the narrative. It's not many, whereas the answer to that same question for quote-unquote straight narratives is kinda all of them. And while there's a facing reality of the world as it is, not as you wish it aspect to that, escapism from the harsher parts of reality is a big part of why we have fantasy in the first place, especially fantasy for kids that helps them imagine not just alternate better worlds, but better possible futures. The now concluded She-Ra reboot earned its positive reviews, long for Netflix 5-season run, and devoted fans by being well written and creatively produced, but I wouldn't be surprised if the special devotion in particular it appeared to earn from a generation of LGBTQ youngsters and the young at heart came down in large part to how it offered not just a heroine that was fighting from their side, but maybe a glimpse at what a world might look like or feel like when they didn't need to fight anymore. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.